Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them and give us a review. In the spring of 431 BC, in the rugged terrain of central Greece, the political fault lines of the Hellenic world split apart. The city-states of Athens and Sparta stood at the brink of what would become a protracted, brutal conflict, the Peloponnesian War. Decades of uneasy alliances, shifting loyalties, and competing hegemonies had eroded the balance of power. Smaller pulleys were drawn into the widening gyre, caught between the demands of survival and the expectations of the greater powers. One of those cities stood at a militarily vital crossroads between northern and southern Greece. For decades, it had maneuvered through pressure from surrounding powers, allying with Athens, resisting Thebes, and at times even cooperating with Sparta. But geography made neutrality impossible. And when war came, the city's strategic position made it an immediate target. Its fate would be decided not in a day, but through a prolonged confrontation that combined raw siegecraft with the moral and political disintegration of the Greek world. The decisions made by both aggressors and defenders during that confrontation revealed a turning point in the nature of warfare, diplomacy, and alliance. Siege warfare in the Greek world was transformed. The old reliance on direct assault gave way to containment, attrition, and engineering. Greek commanders adapted new technologies and siege methods, some borrowed from Eastern enemies, others developed through necessity. But even more significant was what happened after the fighting stopped. The logic behind the victor's judgment laid bare a shift in political morality that reverberated far beyond that single battlefield. This was the moment when tradition was cast aside in favor of short-term strategic calculation, and marked the collapse of the old Greek ideal that alliances, once forged through common sacrifice, could outlast shifting interests. From this point forward, interstate relations in Greece would be driven less by memory and shared struggle, and more by utility and suspicion. It was a shift that echoed through the remainder of the Peloponnesian War, shaped the rise of Macedon, and laid the cultural groundwork for the cynicism of the Hellenistic age. What happened in this moment didn't just change one city. It fractured the principles that once held the Greek world together. Let's now experience the Siege of Plataea.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 37, The Siege of Plataea, from May of 429 to the summer of 427 BC. Spartan Forces, unknown. Modern historians speculate at roughly 30,000 soldiers. Plataean, 400 Plataean and 80 Athenian soldiers. Plataea represented the first large-scale deployment of siege technology and engineered tactics in Greek warfare, an evolution that redefined how cities were attacked and defended. But its legacy reached further. It signaled the beginning of a deeper collapse, the unraveling of the social fabric and psychological cohesion that had once bound the Hellenic world. From that point forward, betrayal carried more currency than loyalty, and expediency replaced shared memory as the foundation of alliance.
Plataea sat exposed, perched like a watchtower at the throat of two great passes in Boeotia, one channel veering toward the warrior lords of Sparta, the other threading straight into the heartland of Athens, a town caught between titans. Trade flowed well enough through Plataea's gates, but the coin it earned was soaked in the risk of war. Any power hoping to stretch its grip or hold its flank had no choice. They had to own Plataea, no exceptions. As if two war-hardened powers to the south weren't enough, Thebes loomed from the north, just 9 miles off, and every few years, it remembered its appetite for conquest. Thebes wasn't just a neighbor, it was the constant enemy at the door, and so Plataea learned to survive by reaching southward, calling for help from whichever southern juggernaut it hadn't offended that season. In 519 BC, Thebes tried to shove its way into regional dominance by cobbling together a Boeotian league with itself on top, naturally. Athens answered Plataea's call and cut that ambition short. 30 years later, the men of Plataea stood in formation beside the Athenians at Marathon, holding their line against the full weight of the Persian advance. 10 years after that, the war ended where it should have, on Plataean soil. It was there the last of the Persian war machine bled out in Greece. In the decades that followed, Plataea proved flexible. When Sparta faced rebellion from the underclass it had long trampled, Plataea stepped in with steel and discipline to help crush the unrest. Then came the 450s. Plataea helped Athens tighten its grip on Boeotia, and even after Boeotia broke free in 447, Plataea stayed loyal to Athens. It was a choice that would cost them. So when the inevitable came, when Athens and Sparta finally turned on each other in 432, Plataea was in no mood to pick a side. It had ties to both. It didn't want war, but it got one anyway. Inside the walls, the debate roared. Every household, every assembly was divided. The common folk backed Athens. The aristocrats, eyes on Thebes and old Boeotian ties, leaned the other way. In the dark spring of 431 BC, the noblemen moved. They opened the gates and let in 300 Thebans under cover of night, quiet and ready. But the Thebans hesitated. They tried persuasion instead of power, and that gave the Plataeans their chance. The town exploded into action, and by dawn the Theban force was either dead or they were in chains. The Plataeans held the captured Thebans, 180 men, as leverage. They demanded Thebes stand down, and Thebes did. And then the prisoners were executed, every last one, cold and final. Athens knew it was a reckless move, but the die was cast. They pulled out the civilians and reinforced the city with 80 more soldiers, joining the 400 already stationed there. Plataea, from that moment on, belonged to the Athenian side. That choice sealed their fate. When the war between Athens and Sparta erupted in full, Plataea stood locked beside the Athenians, whether it wanted it or not. After 2 failed forays into Athenian territory, the Spartans changed direction. In 429, they marched north with their Theban allies, thousands strong, and set their sights on Plataea. Surrounded and staring down a sea of shields and spears, the Plataeans sent envoys straight to King Archidamos II of Sparta, hoping to speak sense before blood was spilled. They reminded him, point blank, that after the victory over Persia in 479, every Greek city had sworn a sacred oath to defend Plataea, the very soil where freedom had been won. Archidamos didn't flinch. He said he'd honor the oath, but only if Plataea would break from Athens, fight them, or at least stay out of the way. But the Plataeans couldn't take that deal. Their women, their children, already sheltered in Athens. To betray Athens now would be to leave their families to the wolves. So Archidamos made a second offer. Sparta would take custody of the city and its land temporarily. The Plataeans could leave unharmed, go where they pleased, and Sparta would even pay rent on the ground it occupied. When the war ended, they could come back. To the men inside the walls, it sounded like a fair deal, but Athens said no, and the garrison obeyed. When the Spartans heard Plataea would not yield, they didn't hesitate, and the siege began in full. Archidamos moved fast. His men stripped the land bare, food, timber, anything of value. Trees were felled in droves. Then they raised a palisade, circling the city tight. Nobody would be slipping out. With perhaps 30,000 men under his command, Archidamos ordered the earth to be moved. The Plataean walls, 30 feet high, about 10 feet thick, were only reachable from the south and southeast. That's where the war machine focused. His engineers got to work. The plan was simple. Build a siege ramp, pile the dirt high, and let the infantry walk straight into the city without climbing or smashing. On paper, with those numbers, Archidamos could have ordered a full assault, but he didn't. And historians still puzzle over that restraint. Maybe it was the memory of failure at Onia 2 years earlier. Maybe he simply respected the wall, 30 feet high, 10 feet thick. Stone like that wasn't going to fall to ropes and ladders or primitive engines. Not then, not easily. Weeks passed. The Spartans shoveled dirt by the ton. Inside, the defenders matched them, raising counterwalls, digging tunnels through their own fortifications, yanking Spartan earth out from beneath the ramp as fast as it came. It worked. They started dumping in huge chunks of clay wrapped in reeds, too massive to drag back through the tunnels. It's strange looking back that the Spartans never tried undermining the walls themselves. Plataea had shown them how, but Archidamos didn't take the bait. So the defenders doubled down. Inside the city, they built another wall, a curved barrier, a lunette. When the mound hit the first wall, attackers would meet a second. Worse still, they'd be exposed, with the curve turning them into targets from all angles. Once the earthen ramp neared its peak, Archidamos ordered in the battering rams, monstrous logs tipped with iron. But the Plataeans were ready. They answered strength with cunning. From the heights, Plataean soldiers flung nooses down onto the rams, tightened them, and pulled, hauling the weapons upward, lifting them uselessly off the ground and stripping them of their power. And when that wasn't enough, they dropped logs, massive, weighty timbers from the ramparts, smashing the rams beneath. Frustration eventually turned to fury. Archidamos shifted tactics, and he ordered fire. Brush was stacked high along the base of the wall, drenched in pitch and sulfur, possibly even arsenic. This wasn't just fire, this was the first chemical assault in recorded history. They hurled brush into the city too, hoping to ignite chaos behind the defenses. Most of the city's timber was already torn down for the counterwall, so the flames would have no mercy if they caught. But the gods, or the sky, had other plans. The wind turned. Some say a storm rolled in. The fire died before it could finish the job. Archidamos shifted again. With winter nearing and crops to harvest, he released most of his men. The rest stayed behind to fortify the siege, raising a tighter inner wall, and then a second outer ring 16 feet beyond, facing outward to guard against Athenian reinforcements. Roughly 2,000 Spartan and Boeotian soldiers were left to hold the line through the bitter winter, watching, waiting, and tightening that noose around Plataea. Inside, the garrison held steady, small in number, but sharp in preparation. They stockpiled food, enough to hold out. Starvation for them would not come quickly. But months dragged on. No sign of Athenian aid. Finally, in the dark stretch of winter, 429 into 428 BC, a priest named Theanidas and a soldier named Eupompedus stepped forward with a plan, a dangerous one. Wait for a storm, they said. No moon, no light. On that night, they'd slip the noose. They'd seen it before. During storms, the enemy guards tucked into the towers for cover. That would be their opening. That was when they'd climb. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Get over the inner wall, haul up ladders, cross the space, scale the second wall, and vanish into the dark. When the night finally came, black sky, rain hammering the ground, only 220 men dared to try. The first wall fell behind them, but as they climbed, loose bricks rattled and fell, loud enough to wake the defenders. The escapees moved fast, took to the towers flanking the gap. Archers held the enemy back, and arrows cutting the night. Every second bought with violence. They climbed the second wall under fire, but beyond it waited a ditch filled with icy water, neck deep. The very pit that had supplied the clay for the enemy's bricks now threatened to drag them down. They plunged in, freezing, gasping. Every man but one made it across. That one turned back and surrendered. The Spartans lit signal fires to call reinforcements from Thebes, but the Plataeans, always thinking, lit decoy fires across the hills. Signals blurred, and the call went unanswered. The fugitives didn't run toward Athens, they ran the other way, toward Thebes. That threw the Spartans off. Once the chase took bait, the men veered, circling wide, and slipped back to Athens. Those left behind assumed all had perished. It wasn't until they asked the Spartans to retrieve the bodies that the truth came out. There were no bodies. The plan had worked. The ones who stayed had over a year to live with that decision. With fewer mouths to feed, their rations held through one more brutal winter, dragging the siege into the summer of 427. When that summer came, the final Spartan push was quiet, relentless, and it was effective. The defenders surrendered. They had no fight left in them. There was a trial, if it could be called that. 200 Plataeans, 25 Athenians, every one of them executed. The women who had fed the garrison were marched off and sold into slavery. The ones who had escaped and those who'd made it to Athens before the siege closed in were granted citizenship, a gift from the city they'd risked everything for. They waited in exile, kept alive by the promise of return. Only when the war ended did they set foot again in the land that had cost them everything. Years later, another war came, Sparta against Thebes again. Plataea stood with Sparta this time. It made little difference. Their new allies proved no more loyal than the last. In 373 BC, Thebes struck without warning. Plataea fell again, occupied, stripped of freedom once more. It wasn't until 338 BC, when Philip of Macedon swept through with iron and ambition, that the Plataeans finally reclaimed their city, but by then it was a different world. Thucydides, a precise, cold-eyed, relentless man, gave us the first Greek record of siege warfare. Battering rams, dirt rams, encircling walls. The siege of Plataea wasn't just history, it was innovation, written in blood. Historians still argue how the Spartans learned these methods. Some say they borrowed them from the Persians. Others think Carthaginian techniques from Sicily slipped into Spartan hands. Then again, some give credit to Archidamos himself, that he conceived the ramp, the rams, the double wall. If so, it was a leap forward for Greek warfare. Whatever the origin, the outcome remained constant. Not once during the entire Peloponnesian War was a walled city taken by direct assault, not one. Force alone failed. Deceit remained the Greeks' sharpest weapon against a city's walls. But the siege wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The surrendered Plataeans were promised a fair hearing. Instead, each man was asked a single question, quote, "What have you done for Sparta in this war?" End quote. The Plataeans blamed Thebes. They argued they had no choice but to side with Athens. Thebes had betrayed Greece once already, joining Persia during the Great Invasion. The Thebans shot back that such betrayal was the fault of their leaders, not the people. The citizens had merely followed orders. But none of it mattered. The Spartans weren't interested in justifications. The question remained, what did you do for us? And when the answer was silence, they executed them all. Quote, "The significance of the Spartan action, brutal as it may have been, did not lay with the execution of the Plataeans. Why they acted was more important than what they did. For the reasoning brought to the surface, without apologies and for all to examine, the attitude which destabilized their own world. Alliances between states, as between families, evolved over generations. The Sparta, the greatest champion of conservative values of the Greek elite, could brush aside profound attachments which had been established in the memory of men still living, and which solemn rituals kept alive year by year, then there was no basis for long-term loyalty to any state." End quote. As historian Gregory reminded us, it wasn't the executions that shook the foundation of the Greek world, it was the reasoning behind them. The horror laid not in the sword stroke, but in the question asked before it fell. What have you done for Sparta? That was all that mattered. Not past alliances, not shared blood on the field of Marathon, not sacred oaths made beneath the gods. Sparta, the self-proclaimed guardian of ancestral values, of memory, of loyalty, had erased centuries of friendship with one question. And in doing so, they exposed a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. If Sparta could discard its oldest allies without shame, then no alliance, no oath, no shared history was safe. Not then, and not ever. Loyalty, once the backbone of the Greek world, had become currency, spent or withheld for advantage. That was the true cost of Plataea. Not the fall of the city, not the blood in the streets, but the death of trust itself. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comments section. User NPM313 wrote this in a review. The title is Interesting Show, MAGA Are Scum. And now the body of the comment. I enjoyed the show. To be sure, the proudly ignorant Christian nationalists attempting to rewrite American history, let alone the ones who stormed the Capitol as fellow Americans, is short-sighted and foolish. The remnants of the Confederacy were treated too kindly, and now those remnants are in charge of the federal government in a hostile takeover. MAGA are traitors who only deserve compassion after a true apology. NPM 313, thank you for listening and for sharing your thoughts so candidly. I hear your frustrations, and you're right that attempts to rewrite history or to excuse violence against our democratic institutions deserve serious scrutiny. There's no question that on January 6th, the Capitol was breached, and those who fueled or participated in it on both sides of the aisle should be held accountable under the law. That said, I'd offer this. American identity has always been a complex and often uncomfortable mix of ideals, contradictions, and fierce disagreements. We've endured civil war, struggled through Reconstruction, clashed over civil rights, and still we've managed to come out the other side battered but intact. Part of that survival has come from our ability to hold the line on values like free speech, due process, and yes, even the belief that fellow citizens can be different than us. At the same time, I think we have to be cautious about how we label our fellow citizens, even in anger. Calling entire groups of Americans traitors or suggesting they're beyond some sort of redemption can set us on a dangerous path. Once we start deciding who is or who isn't worthy of compassion, the word you used, we start playing God with the soul of the republic. And that's not how our American democratic republic was built. But it is how democracies fall apart. The American project has always been messy, loud, divided, even painful. But we've endured because we've held tight to a few shared values, chief among them the idea that citizens are still part of the national fabric. That doesn't mean accepting lies, especially from politicians. It doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving wrongdoings without real accountability. But it does mean resisting the urge to dehumanize, because history shows us that once people stop seeing each other as fellow Americans, the next chapter rarely ends well. So let's stand firm against extremism on both sides of the aisle. But let's also be careful not to lose ourselves in the process. Justice, yes, but justice with humility, not vengeance. That is the heart of a strong republic. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.